Good to see all of you this morning. It's a beautiful day. It's a wonderful day to worship our God and our Lord. And I'd like to look at what I think is just a fascinating relationship that is shown to us in the Bible. And that is the one between Jesus and the Pharisees. And the Pharisee name means to separate. And the Pharisees did separate themselves from the common people. They seemed to think of themselves more highly than lay people and were the most prominent sect of the religious and political Jewish leaders in the time of Jesus. They strove for a certain form of purity, although they were misguided in their execution of that. And it was not purity from bad hygiene or from dirt, but the proper observance of religious rituals that distinguish the clean from the unclean. And this is probably why one of the interactions we read of in Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 10, one of the interactions that offended the Pharisees so much beginning in verse 10, "And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?'" And so what we see is that Jesus flagrantly broke their rules. To them, he was unclean. He was impure by their standards. And so there became this rift of completely different worldviews at war with each other about what constituted right and what was wrong. What constituted serving God to Jesus was blasphemy to the Pharisees. And so what we have in this story is two irreconcilable ideologies. And when that happens, either one side is going to concede to the other, or the pressure continues to mount until the volcano erupts, as it were. Jesus, being the way, the truth, and the life, out of principle, could not concede, and he couldn't even compromise on his divine position. And the Pharisees, being full of pride and lusting for power, refused to bend their will. So when the truth refuses to bow to lies, when good refuses to endorse evil, there comes an ugly collision at some point, and indeed that is what happened. So let's look at a history of interaction with Jesus and the Pharisees. The first one I'd like to look at is in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 17. Jesus explains the fundamental difference between himself and the Pharisees here. And he says in Matthew 5:17, "He came to fulfill the law, but they could not accept that, and only clung tight to the laws at the expense of seeing Jesus for who he was." And he says in verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And then in verse 20 he says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So Jesus, as the fulfiller of the law, exposes the problem of the Pharisees and their teaching, and the consequence of their teaching would be never entering the kingdom of heaven. And this will create a divide between Jesus and the Pharisees, and the divide becomes more and more a problem as Jesus gains more followers and more popularity. And as he began to teach, people could recognize that Jesus was special. There was something unique and genuine about him. But they weren't sure if he was a prophet. They didn't know if he was the Messiah. But he was definitely gaining more and more attention from the people. And at some point, the Pharisees, recognizing this, decided to send some officers to go arrest Jesus. They were saying, "We can't have this. We've got to shut this guy down. This is not going to work. He's encroaching on our power, and we can't have the people following him. So let's pick up in John chapter 7 and verse 40 to look at, this is really a very telling interaction that we see here in John chapter 7, beginning in verse 40. When they heard these words, some of the people said, "This really is the prophet." Others said, "This is the Christ." But some said, "Is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was?" So there was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. The officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why did you not bring him?" And the officers said, "No one ever spoke like this man." The Pharisees answered them, "Have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed." And Nicodemus, who had gone to him before, and who was one of them, said to them, "Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does?" And they replied to Nicodemus, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." There's a number of takeaways just from this set of verses, a couple that I want to touch on. The first being that plain and ordinary people can recognize the truth when they're shown it. They don't need a ruling class to tell them what it is or what it is not. And in this case, the class was deliberately trying to conceal what the truth was. They didn't want them knowing what the truth was. Another point is the very fact that Jesus showed up caused division. To accept who he really was and what he represented is a radical notion that is not easy to accept. And I think by extension, if we come with this good message, the message of God, it's likely to cause division. The world just does not seem to be able to handle it. Another point to be made is the evil hearts of the Pharisees already on display here. They are not even willing to acknowledge with humility who Jesus might be. The fact that they want to discredit him speaks volumes of what they must have known in their hearts, or they wouldn't have worked so hard to silence him. And the ugly truth is they only cared about their own power. Notice the derision and dismissiveness of the Pharisees' words and tone when they address those who would even consider that Jesus may be a prophet or more. If we go back in verse 47, it says, "The Pharisees answered them, 'Have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or Pharisees believed in him?'" We don't believe in him. You can't believe him if we don't believe in him, if we don't give our endorsement to him. Have you been deceived? Have you been taken in? Have you been tricked? When corrupt leaders accuse its people of being deceived, it's very likely that means that those people are being exposed to the truth. When the Pharisees turn to insulting their own people as these lowly, accursed, these deplorable, uneducated commoners, they're afraid. They know something's happening that they need to be afraid of. They knew that any right-minded person could see the signs and understand the plain-spoken truth that Jesus was teaching, and they were enraged by it. And since they couldn't actually engage in a logical argument against Jesus, they resorted to shaming people for listening to him with no basis whatsoever. And then when Nicodemus, a Pharisee himself, suggests that they just give Jesus a fair hearing to actually listen to the facts, what do? Just listen to the arrogant contempt of the Pharisees' answer here in verse 52. So this is the Pharisees replying to Nicodemus when he suggests they listen to the facts, give Jesus a fair hearing. They say, well, are you from Galilee too? Are you one of those lowlifes too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. See what's happening here. The Pharisees have decided what's true, what's not, and they're going to control the narrative. And if anyone suggests actually looking into the facts, instead of doing that, they just insult the person who wants to take an honest look at the facts. They shame them, they burn them to the ground, they shut them down. And precisely the thing that is truth, precisely the thing that is important, precisely the person who has brought the fulfillment of the law they claim to be following, they disregard, they dismiss. They silence it, they ignore it. And it's really disgusting. You thought cancel culture was new? Just 2,000 years ago, cancel culture was right in the face of the people trying to bring the facts up. Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and that you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of the miracle, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? It's helpful to get the biblical commentary on what's happening here, because without it, you may just assume that the Pharisees here were actually giving Jesus some compliments. You know, they kind of lead in saying that you are true and you teach the way of God truthfully. You're not really swayed by people's opinion. But in reality, they are not interested in compliments, and they're not interested in the truth. They're manipulators, they're full of malice and evil, and they're trying to trap Jesus in his words. And as such, their compliments are actually just mockery. So notice that instead of just asking their questions, they kind of editorialize Jesus' character with this mockery. And they make these digs at him before they even get to their question. And I kind of read it like this. It's kind of like they're saying, well, Jesus, you don't really care about anyone's opinion. You really don't have any tact, and apparently you're the smartest guy to ever live, so tell us what you think about taxes. You know, it's kind of that kind of lead-in where they're just trying to get under his skin, and he knows it. He calls them out as hypocrites on the spot. But it's just so dirty, so wrong to see people twist and berate an innocent person this way. Very aggravating. But when the Pharisees failed to silence Jesus, and they failed to entangle him with their manipulative questions, they had to keep ratcheting up the stakes. This is what happened after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. This is in John chapter 11, beginning in verse 45. It says, Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and seen what he did, believed in him. And what he did was he raised Lazarus from the dead. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not only for the nation, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So, from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus is a problem for the establishment. He is clearly in the right, and they know it. But they had refused to acknowledge it. When these establishment corrupt leaders saw such an imminent threat to their authority, they proved to take any measure, lie, cheat, murder, whatever it took, to eradicate Jesus, the truth teller. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Their lust for power drives them to rationalize, well, it's better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. The nation was not going to perish if Jesus had more followers, if he was allowed to live. They would have been free of the lies and the tyranny that these charlatans were peddling if he were allowed to live and teach freely. When the Pharisees say, we need to eliminate this man for your benefit, for your protection, that is code speak for our power is at risk, our power is threatened, we are going to stay in power, and we will take up whatever means necessary, including the murder of an innocent man, to preserve it. And that is exactly what they did. Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 55. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. So we've already seen where the Pharisees try to suppress the truth of Jesus, deny him a fair hearing based on actual facts. They don't want to hear that. So if the facts that you want don't exist, what do you do? Well, if you're corrupt, you just seek the testimony that you want to fit your narrative. And in this case, to fit the narrative of putting Jesus to death. So you start peddling in false witnesses. And if anyone questions you about why you're listening to false witnesses, you just say, well, you can't question the sanctity of our office. It couldn't conceivably be compromised. The interesting thing about false witnesses is that they get the stand. They get the spotlight. Even if it's false, the testimony is front and center. The corrections always run on the 5th page of the Wednesday edition of the newspaper that never gets circulated, right? As it were. But the false witness is there getting to tell the false story, which gets repeated and gets to be the narrative. And it worked. They were able to create this narrative against Jesus to ultimately kill him, to rile up the people to believe it. This is the extent that corrupt leaders will go to keep their power. Jesus knew it firsthand. Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 15. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner who they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said, Let him be crucified. And he said, Why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, Let him be crucified. Do you understand the pure evil of the Pharisees? That they're over here pulling the strings, steering the narrative. They've deliberately concealed evidence of his innocence. They've refused a fair hearing. They've planted false witnesses. They've emphasized a misguided accusation against Jesus as a blasphemer. They make him out to be a criminal worthy of death. They stir up the crowd, these people, to exchange Jesus to be crucified instead of Barabbas. It's very discouraging to see such blatant evil maintain power to go unchecked by a society that claimed to be based on the very law that Jesus came to fulfill. When facts don't matter, corrupt narratives reign. Jesus sees the lies and the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and he exposes them for the frauds that they are. I want to read with you Matthew chapter 23. I did not put, because we're going to read through the whole chapter almost, I did not put all those on the slide, so if you'd like to open your Bible up and follow along, I encourage you to. So before Jesus was crucified, he addresses the Pharisees in as blunt and as plain of a scathing address as he could in Matthew chapter 23. And this is not him losing his temper. This is not him spewing hate speech. This is not him inciting violence. This is not him stooping to their level. But so that no one is misunderstood, he is going to label who the Pharisees actually are and call them out for who they are. Matthew chapter 23, let's begin in verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but do not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. They make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbis by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in the people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, If anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, If anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, You clean the outside there. So you blind, clean the inside. Outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murder the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify. Some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous bloodshed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah to Bechariah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And we'll stop there for Matthew chapter 23. The Pharisees were the supposed spiritual and political leaders of the Jews in this day, but it appears that their lives were examples of everything precisely not to be and do. You see what Jesus calls them here is a number of things that are not very subtle, blind guides, that they focus on superficial appearances, they're hypocritical, they're greedy, self-indulgent, and self-congratulatory. They are lawless, they are murderous. He calls them a brood of vipers, sons of hell. They shut the kingdom of heaven in people's face, and they will not enter the kingdom of heaven themselves. These are the people who called the people who questioned them and believed in Jesus uneducated. They said, you're just these deplorable little people. You're accursed. And Jesus turns it around and says, you're uneducated, you are deplorable, and you are accursed. You're not going to heaven, and you're not helping other people get there. Make no mistake, Jesus was a meek, gentle, kind, loving, forgiving, and compassionate person. But I think he is somewhat underemphasized as an honest and forthright and bold rebuker of false and misleading hypocritical teaching, especially those who were in positions of authority. He told them exactly how it was. With all of that's pretty much what I had to say in terms of the interactions with Jesus and the Pharisees. You get a pretty good idea of how things went. So just a few takeaways from what we see revealed in the Bible here. The first thing that's just kind of obvious to me is it's interesting. By itself, it's just an interesting study to see what happened historically, to see how Jesus and the early Christians interacted with the Pharisees. But it's also much more than that. It's practical. It's meant for us to look at and take some application from, to help shape our own worldview of how things work. Human nature is the same. Circumstances will change, technology changes, the nameplates change, but there's nothing new under the sun. Evil despises good. Evil absolutes truth. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 16, we are told, be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. In your behavior, be innocent. In your understanding, be shrewd. Be aware, be alert. Be mature, be informed. Be realistic. Know how evil people operate. Know how they think. Jesus brought incredible unveiling of how evil powers twist and malign and falsely accuse and stir up masses against the innocent, the pure, the loving, the very truth itself. There's practical application there. Another takeaway is that it's okay to recognize and call out evil and hypocrisy for what it is. And Jesus does that plainly. As it relates to us today, recognizing the sanctity of life, regarding people of any race and color as being equal, believing that God created each of us as a male or a female, honoring marriage between a man and a woman, and other such foundational biblical principles are not false. And when people teach against it, it's okay for us to say that that's false. It's not hate speech. It's not inciting violence. It's not racist. It's simply discerning right from wrong and taking a stand for what's right. And we shouldn't be afraid or ashamed to do that. It's important to note, too, that Jesus was not a politician. He doesn't need your vote. He didn't show any desire to wade into politics. But when politics and corrupt political leaders encroached onto religious and moral teaching, he didn't back down either. And he stood for what was true. He dealt with their lies and their hypocrisy and their evil hearts in no uncertain terms. Another important takeaway is that Christianity is not designed to overthrow a government. Jesus was only trying to teach and train hearts in the truth. He plainly exposed the hypocrisy where it existed. What he never did or encouraged his followers to do is establish an earthly kingdom, to instigate, to stage a coup, although that's what he was accused of doing, and the other side was actually doing it. That's not to say that clear understanding and adherence to godly principles wouldn't change these governing powers. Surely it would and it should. But that should come about by those people receiving the message of the gospel and not by using violent force. And that can be a difficult idea to adhere to. I understand that. When we see injustice, we want to take action. We want to right wrong. We want to fight back. Peter did. When they came to take his king, Peter drew the sword. He cut a man's ear off. But even Jesus himself signed himself over to those evil men, knowing their hearts, knowing the injustice about to be inflicted on him. He was not there to overthrow, but to lead a peaceful example and to fulfill his purpose. Another important takeaway is to be careful of the narrative that you believe. I think the Pharisees give us an insight to a worldview for us to understand that's really we should be grateful for. It just exposes so much. And I think one of the takeaways is that when you have a known corrupt leadership, that whenever they're trying to say one thing is true or suppress something else that's actually true, it's probably false, what they're trying to. And you see that exactly with the Pharisees. They were always trying to shift the narrative and conceal what was true and promote what was untrue. And from that perspective, you could almost always take the opposite of what they were saying to be what was actually going on. Be very careful of the narrative that you believe. Another takeaway is that the unthinkable can happen. Jesus knew that the gears of evil were turning and said to Judas before Judas betrayed him, "What you do quickly." He did not try to do a lot of convincing at that point or mount a defense. He had already taught the truth. He had already performed many miracles. If someone wanted to believe in him, the evidence was sufficient to believe in him. A good and honest heart would, a corrupted heart would not, and would go the other way. But at that point, the collision course was set. The volcano was about to erupt. And what does Jesus do? What should we do if the truth that Jesus taught, that we subscribe to, that we know, and that we love is twisted to be false? If it's twisted to be intolerant, if it's twisted to be hateful? What do you do when you're shut up? When you're deplatformed? When you're demonized? When you're deliberately tripped up in a question meant to trap you, or a false witness that's brought against you, or when your livelihood is threatened, or your life is threatened? Oh, we live in America, that'll never happen. Oh, the Pharisees are strict law-abiding spiritual leaders. They don't really mean to do any harm. Oh, they silence the facts, but they wouldn't try to deliberately trip Jesus up in his words. Oh, they did that? Okay, well, but they wouldn't bring a false witness against him. That's just crazy. Yeah, they did that too. Okay, but surely they wouldn't trade him for a criminal and have him killed. That's conspiracy theory. You're way out on a limb. That would never happen. Yeah, they did. Yeah, but then afterwards, surely they recognized that he was resurrected. I mean, he did come out of the grave, and surely then they changed and they repented. At least they didn't go after his disciples. Yeah, they did. And when Stephen went back and told them that they killed the Messiah, they killed him too. And it just kept going and going. The unthinkable can happen. You may be in denial at each step of the path, but unthinkable things have a way of coming around and happening sometimes. Hope of us does not get more difficult, but it may, and we need to be prepared in our minds. What are we going to do when it does? Where do we stand? Are we going to give in to that false narrative if it becomes more and more forced? Or do you stick to the truth? And there can be consequences to sticking to the truth. I mean, we've seen it in the Bible over and over again. What would Jesus do? He just stuck to the truth. So if we're faced with that, we do what Jesus does. We entrust ourselves to the Father who's faithful, who promises deliverance. What would Jesus do? He would stand up for the truth and stand down for violence. And that's pretty simple. That's pretty much it. And he would have us do the same. One final takeaway. Everyone has a choice. Chapter 3, we read of Nicodemus. He was one of the Pharisees. Nicodemus came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher, come from God, for no one can do the signs that you do unless God is with him." Jesus often addressed the Pharisees as like this homogenous group. He just says the Pharisees. Not every time he addresses them does he put an asterisk on there and say, all the different qualifications. So in general, the Pharisees were terrible people, as he points out. But they weren't destined to be, and they weren't each and every one of them that way. And they had a choice whether they continued to follow that narrative or whether they accepted the truth of what it was. And Nicodemus was an example of that. He wanted to give Jesus a fair trial. He didn't have the clout to make it happen, but he saw what was going on. And he recognized Jesus as a legitimate person that needed to be listened to. And there's a powerful takeaway in that for us too, that no matter where we are in life, no matter what we've done, no matter how we might be characterized, no matter what group we may have been associated with, that actually be in the wrong, you can walk away from it. You can make that change, and Jesus invites us to. Jesus was not unwilling to talk to Nicodemus. He was welcome to talk to Nicodemus. He engaged him. And he'll engage us if we reach out to him. He'll take us and accept us if we'll follow him and accept his truth. I pray that we will. I pray that we recognize Jesus' truth. It is different from what the world preaches. The world is trying to push false narratives. It always has, and it will probably continue to, unfortunately. Isn't it wonderful to have the book of life to look at and to look into and to learn from and to set our steps from? It's just, can you imagine not having that? Just imagine if that's taken away. I mean, all you're left with is the corrupt lies that would otherwise just go unchecked. Check yourself. Look into it. It's awesome. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. Jesus invites you. If you would like to come and make any sin yourself right like Nicodemus did, do it today. We invite you to do that thing.